Today, I will talk about the Hebbian learning and how we can infer its form from cortical activity and how such a Hebbian learning can be related to the brain oscillation. So the activity-dependent modification of the synaptic strengths have been suggested as one of the basic mechanisms of the learning. And such an idea have been postulated by Hebb. So in this idea, if the nearby neuron A and B happen to fire together, then there can be a change in the synaptic connection, especially the potentiation. So such a change of a synaptic connection can reflect the correlative firing in the past of these two nearby neuron. So it can be a substrate for the learning and a long-term memory. The properties of such an original Hebb's rule can be summarized in these two features. The one is local and unsupervised, that is, without any error or the feedback signal from the external system. And the second one is associative, that is reflecting the correlative firing of a pre and a post-synaptic activity. So the Hebb's rule became one of the major doctrine in the neuroscience and was applied to explain the development of early visual system, for instance. So implementing such a Hebbian rule in the thalamocortical thalamic input to the early visual system, then it can explain the development of stimulus selectivity, such as the ocular dominance column or the orientation selectivity. Also, in the seminal work by the Hopfield, the Hebbian rule was implemented in the recurrent connection and can be a underlying mechanism for the associative long-term memory. So in the recurrent connection with this Hebbian learning rule, it forms some particular dynamics such as attractor dynamics, and the memorized pattern can be retrieved by a partial cue, which is a desirable property for the long-term memory. So since this seminar work, the broad range of the functions of the Hebb's rule and its variant form have been suggested. So the most basic form is similar to the original Hebbian learning rule. So in this learning rule, if the pre and post-synaptic firing rate is denoted as Rj and Ri, then the weight is denoted as a Wij. Then the change of this synaptic connection is dependent on a fire rate of a pre and a post-synaptic neuron at the current state, that is at the current stimulus. So in the original rule, it was shown as the product of this pre and post-synaptic fire rates. Or in the Infomax rule, it was dependent on the presynaptic fire rate and then nonlinear transformation of the postsynaptic rate. So this original Hebb's rule and its variant form have been suggested to underlie like extraction, the feature extraction or auto-associative memory as in the Hopfield network. Another important variant is the temporally asymmetric learning rule, which associate the activity for the current state, like a postsynaptic activity at the current stimulus, and presynaptic activity for the past stimulus. So in this case, it is called as forming the hetero-associative memory, that is connecting, associating the different patterns at the different time, and suggested to extract the coarse invariance representation based on the temporal contiguity of the stimulus. So the recent work highlights the role of this type of the variant form of the Hebbian learning rule, among which I would like to introduce the two of them. So first notable work is done by Krotov and Hopfield. In this work, they consider the two-layer structure for the simple recognition task. So in the first layer, the connectivity is trained by the variant of the Hebbian learning. And the second layer is trained by supervised learning for the object recognition, for the simple object recognition like MNIST. And then they call it as the bio learning and compare the performance to the entirely supervised learning like a backpropagation. And they show that this bio learning is inferior compared to the BP trained one for the trained data set. But for the test data set, the BP trained one is shown as the, let me see, the green, and the bio trained one is the red. So they shows the similar performance. And this similar performance might be due to the property of the Hebbian learning rule that can extract the load measure representation of the stimuli. And this load measure representation formed in this first layer in the unsupervised way might be advantageous for the generalization. Okay. So the novel stimuli, these test stimuli, can be efficiently learned. And overall, this work suggests that good generalization performance combined with supervised learning. So this biologically plausible unsupervised learning might not be inferior to the totally supervised learning. Another example is the work by De Carlos group, suggesting that the temporally asymmetric learning rule may underlie the formation of the invariant representation of the object against the changes in the size or the position or the orientation. Such an invariant representation is very important for the object recognition. And they suggest that in a natural learning, such a transformation, like the change in the size or orientation or the position, may occur naturally in time. So capturing such a temporal contiguity using the temporally asymmetric learning can explain this natural learning, and also enables the robust categorization of objects such as a car versus not car. So despite the recent progress in this machine learning inspired work, like indicating the effectiveness of a supervised signal, this recent work is suggesting the efficiency of this unsupervised Hebbian learning in capturing this unsupervised feature of the natural learning, and also might not be inferior to the totally supervised learning when it was combined with the supervised learning. Also here I didn't discuss, but beyond this traditional memory association, recent work is highlighting that Hebbian learning and its variant form can underlie the formation of the context signal or the attentional state. So given this diverse function of Hebbian learning, which may underlie in the brain, the many brain function, cognitive function, so I'd like to discuss how we can infer the specific form of Hebbian learning, that is the dependence on the pre and post-synaptic activity. How can it infer its form from the in vivo data? So previously, the form of the synaptic plasticity has been explored in vitro study because in vitro, most of the cells are silent, and the external input eliciting some particular pattern of the pre and post-synaptic activity, and that can lead to the local changes in the synaptic connections. So it can directly isolate such changes in the pre and post-synaptic activity, and elicits the particular pattern, and can derive this dependence of pre and post-synaptic activity. Either it can be a spike patterns, or it can be a different firing rate pattern. However, if there is an ongoing activity as in vivo, then there will be a feedback loop between the synaptic plasticity and the activity of the neurons. And the changes of the activity observed in vivo study have been suggested as indirect evidence of the synaptic plasticity. For instance, the changes of the activity under some perturbation of the input or perceptual learning has been suggested as some result of this type of learning, the synaptic plasticity. However, in In most of this work, they assume the synaptic plasticity were adapted from an in vitro study and explain the phenomena qualitatively. So here the question I want to address is what are the synaptic plasticity rule in a cortical circuit we can best infer from the data, and also how they shape the network activity and the dynamics. So for this, I consider the changes of the activity pattern observed during the visual learning that may underlie our cognitive ability to detect the novelty versus familiarity. So we have a tremendous amount of ability, capacity to recognize the novel versus a familiar object on the timescale of 100 milliseconds. And this type of memory is called as the recognition memory. So it was thought that this type of memory occurs more autonomously, like unsupervised way, through the repetitive exposure of the stimuli. And the neural substrate for the novelty versus the familiarity detection has been observed in the many brain area, including the inferior temporal cortex, which is the pinnacle of a ventral visual pathway. And the lesion study shows that the inferior temporal cortex is a critical for the object recognition and also the novelty and familiarity detection. So to illustrate the method to infer how we can infer the form of the synaptic plasticity from in vivo data, we consider the data obtained from a Scheinberg set. So in this data, the monkey passively views the novel versus a familiar stimuli, which is shown very shortly. And for each neuron, 125 novel and 100 familiar images were shown, and its response were recorded. And the effect of the visual learning of this familiarity is summarized in the following plots. So the left is a time course of the mean response. So this mean response is the average across the all neurons and all novel stimuli or familiar stimuli shown as the red or the blue here. So in this time course, we can see that the effect of this visual experience start to emerge after the 50 millisecond of the activity onset. And the overall, there was the reduction of the activity for the familiar images. So for the visual, the learned stimuli, there was a less response. Also, we can get the distribution of the fire rates for the different novel and a different novel and a familiar images of one neuron. And this distribution was obtained by averaging the response during the stimulus presentation. So individual data points is time average response for the individual stimulus and in the individual neuron. So in this example, we can see that the distribution was shifted to the left. That is, there is a reduction of the activity as shown in the time course data. But also the selectivity to the stimuli was enhanced. That is the broadening of the distribution with the learning. And this was observed. So there was a putatively excitatory neuron and an inhibitory neuron. And these two effects, like a reduction of the fire rates and the broadening of the distribution, was observed both in the excitatory and inhibitory neurons. But only in the excitatory neurons, the increase in the maximum firing rate was observed. So here, I want to first show the method to infer the synaptic plasticity rule, the dependence on the pre and the post-synaptic rates. And then I want to from the distribution of the activities. First, from the time average response, and then I will discuss its extension to this synaptic plasticity, considering not only these spatial changes, but also considering the dynamic changes. So first, to derive the rule from the time average data, I consider the steady state model of the recurrent circuits. So in this model, the fire rate of this recurrent circuit is denoted as R, and it is maintaining this static equality, which is the transfer, nonlinear transfer of the input currents. And the input is the sum of the recurrent input and then external input. And the recurrent input is the sum of the presynaptic rate weighted by the recurrent connectivity. Okay. And the changes in the synaptic connections we consider only happens in the recurrent synaptic connections. And it is a one update of synaptic connection dependent on the pre and post-synaptic rates. And the goal here is we want to find out the form of this delta W, okay? But what we have is these changes of the distribution of the fire rates before and after learning, that is R and R plus delta R. So to derive the delta W from these changes of the fire rates, there are several steps we have to go through. First, since the synaptic rate is related to the input, so we need to infer what is the change of the input in total. And then from the changes of the input, we want to infer the form of the synaptic plasticity. So to infer the form of the changes of the input currents, we need to find out this input-output transfer function. And to derive this input-output transfer function from the data, we made the assumption on the statistics of the input currents for the novel stimuli, that we assume that it follows a Gaussian statistics. And also we assume that the input-output transfer function is monotonically increasing. Then under this assumption, we could infer this input-output transfer function. And from this input-output transfer function, we could obtain the distribution of the input currents for the novel and the familiar images. And then by comparing the input changes with the learning, delta I now, and we plot it as a function of the length of the stimuli or the firing of before learning. Then the input changes for this particular example case was showing that depression for the low fire rates and then potentiation for the high fire rates, because depression was needed to explain the overall shift, the reduction of the fire rates, while the potentiation was needed to explain this increase in the maximum rates. Then finally, from these changes of the input currents, we wanted to derive the form of the synaptic plasticity. And here, for this, we assume the learning rule, delta W, is a separable function of a pre and a post-synaptic rates. And this post-synaptic dependence is shown as represented as F. And then under this assumption, we can rewrite this F as the function of the delta I with some bias term, which is reflecting the overall changes of the activity in this recurrent circuit divided by presynaptic contribution. And under the assumption that this presynaptic contribution and the bias is a constant across the different stimuli, more or less this postsynaptic dependence is approximately similar, proportional to the changes of the input current. So the changes of the input current shows the depression and then potentiation, and we think under this assumption, the postsynaptic dependence also shows this depression and the potentiation with the adjustment of the bias and then the scaling by this presynaptic dependence. And this method was applied to the individual neuron because we could obtain the distribution for the different neurons. So when you apply this one, then input change, which is analogous to the postsynaptic dependence, shows the diverse pattern, which shows the potentiation only, or the potentiation and the depression, or the depression. But except a few neurons here, red, more or less they are showing the increasing tendency. And this diverse pattern may arise not due to the different postsynaptic dependence, but due to the different bias. So when you average over, then it shows the depression and the potentiation similar to the synaptic plasticity observed in vitro. But this is for the excitatory neurons. And for the inhibitory neurons, note the difference of the this distribution. I mentioned that the maximum fire rate only increased for the excitatory neurons, not for the inhibitory neurons. So when we obtain the input changes across the dependence on the fire rate, it was more or less constant for the inhibitory neurons. So then this input changes, which is a constant, no dependence on the postsynaptic fire rate, might be due to the changes of the excitatory input derived, not due to the synaptic plasticity onto the inhibitory neurons. So in the simplest model, we can consider the recurrent synaptic plasticity with the depression and the potentiation can explain these changes in both excitatory and inhibitory neurons. And also we could apply this one for the individual neuron and found that there is some particular relationship of this threshold dependence on the overfiring activity mean or the standard deviation, which is suggesting that there is some regulation of the learning rule dependent on activity. And this is reminiscent of the BCM rule suggested previously for the development of early visual system, that is suggesting that the threshold for the depression and the potentiation is dynamically adjusted dependent on the activity, over activity. So, so far, I have discussed how we can infer the synaptic plasticity rule from the in vivo data, but we didn't discuss about the temporal changes. It was more or less the changes of the spatial pattern and the tuning of the spatial selectivity, feature selectivity. But now I want to discuss the extent this inference method accounting for the changes of the spatial and temporal patterns together. Because experimentally for the object recognition, there was important changes in the dynamics with the visual learning. So the left panel is what you have seen before, is a mean response across all stimuli, and it shows the reduction of the fire rates for the familiar stimuli. And then we also could extract for each neuron, we could extract the response for the best, the response to the maximum, the best stimuli. And the maximum response to the best stimuli as observed in the this distribution, the widening of the distribution, maximum response was increased for the familiar stimuli. However, in these two plots, you can also notice that there is some dynamic changes that in both cases, mean and the maximum response, there is a rebound of the activity around the 150 millisecond after the activity onset. So the overactivity shows the damped oscillation, and we quantify the rebound strength across the different stimuli by measuring the slope of this response in the late phase across the different stimuli. So this is a summary of across the different length of the stimulus. For the familiar and novel stimuli, the rebound strength shows the different tendency. That for the novel stimuli, more or less across the all different stimuli, there was no rebound, while for the familiar stimuli, there was a rebound, especially for the stimulus eliciting the high response. Such an enhanced damped oscillation with the learning has been observed consistently under the different experimental setting. So this is also a passive viewing task of novel and familiar images, but it is the longer exposure. Like previously, it was only 200 milliseconds, and this time it was around I think it was so it shows the 600 millisecond duration. So for such a longer exposure, now you can see a more pronounced, you can see that this damped oscillation for the familiar stimuli more clearly. Okay. So then what would be the possible role of such a damped oscillation for the after, which is observed after when the stimuli become familiar? So Carl Olson's group have postulated that the changes in the response dynamics can be important for the rapid processing of the familiar stimuli compared to the novel stimuli. Because we have experienced that among the familiar stimuli, we can detect the peculiar stimuli very quickly, but among the novel stimuli, it takes a longer to detect some familiar stimuli. So we are uh, able to process the familiar stimuli more quickly. So to test this idea, they designed the experiment showing the novel and the familiar images successively, like the two novel images or two familiar images successively, and measure the response. And it shows that for the familiar images, as for the single exposure, there was a reduction of the firing. But from the second stimuli, the familiar stimuli almost, the recovery is a response. But for the novel images, the second peak was much less than the first peak. Okay? So this suggests that the rapid reduction for the familiar images may be required to make the neurons to be ready for the incoming new stimuli and enable the, the fast dynamic tracking ability for the familiar stimuli. So given this interesting observation of this stronger oscillatory response after learning, I investigate first whether the recurrent synaptic plasticity derived from the time average data can explain such a dynamic changes together. So for this, now we consider the fire rate model considering the time dynamics. So there is only the model considering the time dynamics. And the synaptic changes is still one update of synaptic connection, which is dependent on a pre and a post synaptic rate. But now this delta W is dependent, this F energy is dependent on the average fire rate rather than an instantaneous fire rate because we are considering the slow synaptic plasticity. Then when you implement the synaptic plasticity inferred from the time average data, then as shown in this distribution, the time average case, it could reproduce this reduction of the mean and the maximum increase, but the temporal profile for the novel and the familiar images are quite similar. So it couldn't produce the qualitative changes of the temporal response with the familiarity. So this suggests that there should be some additional component to reproduce the dynamic changes and actually this successive presentations, the experiment is suggesting some existence of the negative feedback because the response for the novel stimuli, for the second stimuli, it couldn't recover to the first one. It wasn't strong as the first one. So this might be due to the slow negative feedback, such as the adaptation or inhibition. And due to the slow recovery from the first stimuli, it couldn't recover it couldn't shows the same strength of the stimulus, the response. So indeed, when you implement such a slow negative feedback, particularly the slow adaptation, the fire rate adaptation, it could reproduce these changes of the temporal patterns. So now we are considering this dynamic equation, but now we are including the adaptation like occurrence, which is a temporal filtered version, linearly filtered fire rates. And also, together with this adaptation occurrence, we consider the synaptic plasticity in the recurrent connection and also the feedforward connection, the synaptic plasticity. So I'm adding the new elements, this adaptation currents, and also this feedforward synaptic plasticity. And I will explain why I add this another components, feedforward synaptic plasticity soon. So to understand how the temporal changes can be derived in this case, we consider the mean field dynamics. So in this mean field dynamics, the fewer variable can capture the qualitative changes of the activity. So we consider the average variable of fire rate and the adaptation, and then overlap with the pattern, which is the inner product with this presynaptic dependence with the activity pattern or the adaptation currents. Then with this mean field dynamics, we could find out the key elements to reproduce such changes we have observed. So the first one is this strong potentiation in the high fire rate neurons. And such a strong potentiation is creating the stronger positive feedback. And this stronger positive feedback together with the slow negative feedback, it can create the oscillation after learning. Okay? And this is pronounced, as this was pronounced in the high fire rate neuron, the potentiation needs to be strongest in these high fire rate neurons. And then it is kind of transmitted to the other neuron proportional to the strength of the this recurrent synaptic plasticity, the dependence on the post-synaptic plasticity. So, and not only this, like enhanced oscillation, previously we have shown that we have seen that the R, the mean fire rate, and the maximum was in phase. This oscillation, damped oscillation, was in phase. And to have an in phase oscillation, then the potentiation, there should be an average potentiation in the recurrent connection. So this is a different point. Time average response to replicate this reduction in the fire rates, there should be some dominant depression of, although there is some potentiation in the high fire rates. But to mimic this in-phase mean and the maximum response, these temporal changes is suggesting the average potentiation rather than an average depression. Then to account for the reduction in the fire rates over, it requires the depression in the feedforward connection. Okay, that's the reason why I added this feedforward the synaptic plasticity. Okay, so using these key elements, we could fit the mean response. We could fit the experimental data obtained from the visual learning task. So first, using the dimming detection task, the mean response for the novel images and familiar images, and it could reproduce this damped oscillator response after learning, and the reduction in the average fire rate with this potentiation in the recurrent connection and the depression in the feedforward connection. And also for the successive stimulus presentation, this result in the stronger oscillator response. And not only this mean equation, also using the time course data for the different novel and the familiar images, we could obtain the dependence on the post-synaptic dependence on the fire rates, this recurrent synaptic plasticity and feedforward synaptic plasticity. And as expected, for the post-synaptic dependence, for the recurrent one is a potentiation dominant, and the feedforward one is a depression dominant. And the right panel is the simulated response. This black curve is a simulated response for the familiar stimuli, which captured again the reduction and the rebound in the average response. And interestingly, this post-synaptic dependence was quite similar to the rebound strengths observed in the putative excitatory neurons. And so this, the rebound strengths can be another graded measure of this post-synaptic dependence of the recurrent synaptic plasticity. So in the second part, I show that by analyzing the spatial and the temporal changes of the activity, we can get the insight into the mechanism, how the synaptic plasticity shape the patterns of the spatial temporal pattern, like how it changes the dynamic of neural circuit, and further reveal the different contribution of feedforward and recurrent connection, which couldn't be dissected when we only look at the changes of the spatial pattern. Okay, so I think I have a few minutes now, and in the remaining time, I will shortly discuss the role of Hebbian learning in the enhanced low frequency oscillation. So up to now, the low frequency oscillation for the familiar images investigated in the inferior temporal cortex was around 5 Hz, which is in the theta range. So interestingly, not only in the this object recognition in the inferior temporal cortex, the experiments in the rodents shows that the similar effect of the visual experience uh, was observed in the early visual area. So in this study, they compared the visual response of the V1 of the awake mic, one is habituated with the gray screen only, and the other one was familiarized with the sinusoidal grading via passive viewing. Okay. And then they have found the experimental group at the Purdue University have found the pronounced oscillation for the experienced group, which is have trained with this sinusoidal grading, especially in the low frequency range. So in both the extracellular and the intracellular recording, the oscillation was increased. They found the oscillation was increased across the all different direction, the preferred or opposite or the orthogonal direction. And also, as in the response, the familiar object in the ITC, there's such an increase in the oscillation accompanies the overall reduction of the fire rates, which is shown here. Okay? So the reduction of the fire rate across the different directions, and also enhance the stimulus selectivity, both for the orientation selectivity and the direction selectivity. So to dissect the underlying mechanism, the Chubikins group measured the synaptic strength of the thalamocortical and the intracortical projection in the naive and the experienced mice. And in the experienced mice, light evoked a response of the postsynaptic current was much smaller, significantly decreased in the thalamocortical projection, while in the intracortical projection from the layer 5 to the different layer was significantly increased. So there is a somewhat consistent with the previous prediction, the derived learning rule, that is a depression in the feedforward connection and then increase in the recurrent connection. So based on these similar activity patterns observed in the ITC, we consider the model which maintains the core features suggested previously, that is a potentiation in the recurrent connection and then depression in the feedforward connection together with a slow adaptation. But now we extended the model such that the network is organized in the one-dimensional ring structure, and each unit has a population of the neuron with a different stimulus selectivity, the feature selectivity. And before the learning, the connectivity is shown as black in the feedforward and the recurrent connection. So before learning, we assume that the recurrent connection is a uniform, and then the structure feedforward input. And after the learning, the feedforward input is kind of a decrease, reflecting this depression, while the recurrent connection become more structured with the local excitation and the global inhibition, which is similar to the Mexican head type of connectivity. So such a structural changes in the connectivity recurrent connection was inspired by the experimental observation that reorganization of the recurrent connection with the development, and also biologically realistic model suggesting some feature selective connectivity in the recurrent connection. Then the model could reproduce the main effects of the visual experience, enhance the feature selectivity. That is, this red is this ratio of the preferred versus the opposite fire rates, and compared to the black one, there was enhanced stimulus selectivity together with the decrease of the fire rates due to the decrease in the feedforward connection. But due to this potentiation in the recurrent connection, the oscillation gets more pronounced after learning, and there is an antiphase due to the inhibition between the preferred and the opposite direction. So there is an antiphase oscillation predicted. So here I show that the V1 is showing the similar effect observed for the familiarity in the ITC. So improve the stimulus selectivity with a reduction in the average activity, and enhanced visual experience. This oscillation was enhanced with the visual experience, And the asymmetric changes in the feedforward and the recurrent connection was critical to explain such a changes, the visual effect, the experience effect. And then I want to shortly add some speculation the role of such a low frequency oscillation arising with the visual experience. Previously, low-frequency oscillation has been discussed in the visual search to characterize the overt exploration or the sampling behavior, or underlie the covert shift of the attention. And in line with this study, Olsen's group have presented, observed that the low-frequency oscillation gets stronger when another stimulus was presented together. So compared to the only presenting the one stimulus, if you are presenting the multiple stimuli, then the oscillation becomes stronger, especially in this low-frequency range. But they have suggested the competitive interaction across the population representing the different stimuli, and also the fatigue mechanism is generating such an oscillation. But they didn't have this intrinsic like a damped oscillation for the individual object. But based on the this damped oscillation observed experimentally and the adaptation mechanism, then competition between these two different familiar stimuli can generate the stronger oscillation, which is more or less replicating their observation. So this may indicate that the damped oscillation, the low frequency oscillation for the single familiar stimulus can be some building block for the rhythmic sampling of across the multiple stimuli or covert shift of the attention. So with that, I'd like to finish here and want to thank my collaborators and also the current lab member. I didn't have a chance to explain the current project, which is extending this inference of the pre and a post-synaptic dependence. So more or less, I focus on the this derivation of the post-synaptic dependence only. But my current lab is utilizing the Bayesian approach to efficiently assess this pre and post synaptic dependence together from the data set.